Israel's 2008-2009 Operation Cast Lead, the assault on Gaza, on the Palestinians of Gaza, there was a new kind of student movement that emerged on U.S. campuses. Our guest speaker describes it in this way in her book. An important movement led by young students, young college students, is taking shape across the United States. In the great tradition of other civil rights and human rights movements, activists are standing up to university administrations and the Israel-aligned political organizations that routinely repress student speech on Palestine. In the face of significant intimidation, students have become powerful organizers in the Palestinian-led Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. They challenge themselves and each other on the definition of solidarity, and they educate their campuses about one of the most important human rights issues of our time. Indeed, this movement of students seeking justice in Palestine has helped to put the BDS movement campaign firmly onto the national map. Our speaker today, journalist Nora Barrows Friedman, describes this as a powerful turning point in Palestine solidarity activism. So she set out to document this movement. In 2013 and early 2014, Nora interviewed 63 student activists representing 30 different universities in 22 cities across 11 states. They, along with others, form the core of this movement, and their voices constitute the powerful message of this book, In Our Power, U.S. Students Organize for Justice in Palestine. Of course, this new student movement in support of Palestinian rights faces many challenges from on and off-campus opponents. But the strength and intelligence of the voices revealed in this book show us that truth, justice, and people power are resilient and are prevailing in this new generation of activists. Nora Barrows Friedman is a journalist, editor, radio broadcaster, musician, and mother. She received her BA in Humanities with a focus on Palestine from the New College of California in San Francisco. She's also the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Media Freedom Award from the Media Freedom Foundation. From 2003 to 2010, Nora was the senior producer and co-host of Flashpoints, which is an investigative news magazine broadcast over the historic Pacifica Radio Network. During her time at Flashpoints, she began covering human rights issues in Palestine and spent several months every year in the occupied West Bank, Gaza Strip, and present-day Israel, reporting from the ground. I think this is one of the strengths of the book we are hearing about today. It's clear that Nora has first-hand experience and perspectives from Israel and Palestine, and therefore can give such necessary context to her research and her interviews. Nora also worked with teenagers and young adults at a radio station and production studio they established at the Ibda Cultural Center in the Dheisheh refugee camp near Bethlehem. She's currently an associate editor of the Electronic Intifada, that's electronicintifada.net, which is an award-winning independent online publication focusing on Palestine and Palestinian rights, where she produces a weekly audio podcast, contributes investigative stories, and blogs about student activism and the Palestinian-led BDS movement and the violations of the rights of Palestinian youth under Israel's occupation. She's written for numerous other online and print publications and news services, including Interpress Service, Al Jazeera English, Truth Out, and Left Turn magazine. She also contributed a chapter to the 2011 Project Censored anthology about U.S. corporate media's lack of appropriate coverage of the situation in Palestine. Nora is also a classically trained cellist, regularly performing with the synth pop band Dialectic and playing with chamber music groups in the San Francisco area. I'll ask Nora to speak about her experiences and research, and particularly about her book, In Our Power. Then we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. And as you can see, we have copies of the book and another recent publication from Just World Books for sale, and so you may buy one afterwards, and I'm sure Nora would be happy to sign it. And we'll talk about the questions later. But anyway, I am so delighted to have Nora Barrows Friedman with us. Welcome.
Thank you, Zena. And thank you to the Jerusalem Fund and the Palestine Center for having me here. It's so good to be here today. I wanted to begin by reading a few words by a friend and colleague of mine, Dina El-Mouti, whose grandmother survived the Deir Yassin massacre, which happened 67 years ago today. She said, "Palestine was never an empty land without a people, and it never will be. Aggressors assume that survivors will forget. They fool themselves more than anyone else. Our narratives remain indestructibly woven into the fabric of our existence, grafted onto our bones and configured into our DNA, passed down from generation to generation. We will never forget what happened in Deir Yassin on April 9th, 1948. We will keep on telling our stories." Thank you, Dina. We're at an incredible moment in Palestine solidarity movement history here in the U.S. I cover student activism at the Electronic Intifada and wrote this book about U.S. student activism on Palestine issues. And every day, pretty much without fail, I receive emails from students all over the country who are preparing for a divestment resolution, that is, a resolution to demand that the university pull its investments in U.S. or transnational corporations that profit from Israel's violations of the rights of Palestinians. I hear from students who are challenging procedural obstacles put in place to crush divestment campaigns by administrations under pressure from Israel-aligned organizations. I hear from students who are planning an extraordinary mock checkpoint, mock wall, or mock eviction action, or who are just getting their Students for Justice in Palestine chapter started and are already facing intimidation and harassment by anti-Palestinian groups or individuals on campus. It's an exciting moment, but it's also a nerve-wracking moment for students. With limited or shrinking or even non-existent resources, students are determined to grow their campaigns by the skin of their teeth, amidst expanding attacks on this movement by well-financed, influential, and intimidating organizations who seek to censor speech critical of the policies of the State of Israel. With each direct action, students highlight the struggle of Palestinians every day. With each divestment resolution, whether or not these resolutions pass, they open the realm of discussion on Israel's policies. With each flyer that they hand out on campus, they educate fellow students about issues that cannot be put back under the covers. Pro-Israel groups cannot debate the facts, so they are resorting to troubling and dangerous tactics intended to shut down discussions and violate the terms of academic freedom and freedom of speech. Israel-aligned organizations are so desperate to shut down this kind of speech that they are spending time and energy and lots of money attempting to litigate and criminalize dissent on campuses, as we saw, for example, with the spate of legal complaints filed against the University of California several years ago. These complaints attempted to say that by the mere presence of Students for Justice in Palestine chapters and the direct actions in support of Palestinian equality and justice and human rights, it created a, quote, hostile atmosphere and made some Jewish students feel uncomfortable and even discriminated against. Of course, this is absurd. One legal complaint filed against the University of California at Berkeley went so far as to compare the campus climate for some Jewish students to the atmosphere at college campuses under the Nazi regime, an offensive and exploitative, desperate claim. These complaints were actually thrown out by the Federal Department of Education, which stated that they had no legal basis and no evidence to prove that Jewish students were being harmed by speech. This newly invigorated attempt to conflate Judaism and Jewish people with the State of Israel is one of the most pernicious efforts of the Israeli lobby and is designed to slander activism in support of Palestinians. As many scholars and activists and Jewish members of the community have pointed out, this conflation is not only offensive, but it is dangerous and is, in fact, ironically, anti-Semitic in and of itself. By presenting all Jews around the world as a monolithic entity, incapable of opposing viewpoints and in full support of the State of Israel, a state that is built upon the ethnic cleansing and oppression of the indigenous people, this conflation infers that all Jews then, no matter where they are therefore directly responsible for Israel's crimes. This is truly anti-Semitic. It's important to note the vocabulary used by Israel-aligned groups to shut down debate or actions in support of Palestinians. Some pro-Israel students say that they would feel marginalized by having to witness even a dramatic reenactment of what Palestinians go through on a daily basis, as though possible emotional distress or hurt feelings were more important to protect on campus than doing something about real-life violence against an occupied population. As UC Berkeley graduate and current lawyer Yaman Salehi said in my book, when talking about mock checkpoint actions at UC Berkeley in the past, and these checkpoint actions were actually cited in one of the legal complaints against UC Berkeley, with some students claiming that they were discriminated against and harassed because of this action. Yaman said that if students complained that they didn't feel safe witnessing a dramatic reenactment of a checkpoint scene, what do you think the real thing is like? He said, quote, "That's the point students were trying to make. If the theatrical version is horrifying to you, then you shouldn't be filing this complaint against the university. You should be organizing against the occupation." Because they cannot debate the facts, Israel-aligned groups try in these divestment debates on campuses, even at events and in classroom discussions, to derail the conversations and present this unequal, unjust reality for Palestinians as one of a simple matter of opinion, and pressure university administrations to hear both sides or don't hear anything at all. Here are some facts about Palestine right now. These are not opinions. It is a fact that Palestinians are under a military occupation in violation of international laws and conventions. It is a fact that Palestinians in Gaza have suffered and resisted through countless invasions and genocidal attacks. It is a fact that Israel destroyed 100,000 homes and buildings last summer in Gaza, creating what the UN says is 4 million tons of rubble. It is a fact that Israel's 8-year-long blockade on Gaza prevents the import of essential goods and reconstruction materials and medicines. It is a fact that 2,200 people were killed, including more than 500 children, over the summer. It is a fact that Israel targeted schools, hospitals, clinics, office buildings, and beaches where children were playing soccer, and not one official, not one soldier has faced charges. Yet that time is undoubtedly coming. It is a fact that after each sustained attack on Gaza, Israel's weapons manufacturers enjoy spikes in their sales because, and this has been documented, they promote their weapons as being field-tested or combat-proven. The Guardian newspaper just came out with a report saying that Israel has supplied 60% of the world's surveillance and militarized drone sales since 1985. Based on data collected by the Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights, a corporate watch investigation found that during the attacks on Gaza last summer, at least 37% of those killed, or 840 people, died in drone strikes alone, and many of them during the night as they slept. Rania Khalek, who's here today, my colleague at the Electronic Intifada, wrote a couple of weeks ago that, quote, "Lost in the numbers is the psychological terror inflicted on the people of Gaza, of the Gaza ghetto, especially children, by the constant presence of drones buzzing overhead with the capacity to rain death on those below at any moment. It is a fact that Palestinian citizens of Israel are forced to live under dozens of state-sanctioned discrimination and segregation laws simply because they are not Jewish. It is a fact that Israel prevents the right of return for the 7 million Palestinian refugees living in diaspora from their homes and property from which they were violently expelled in 1948 and 1967, and today, again, simply because they are not Jewish. It's a fact that some Israeli politicians have openly called for genocide against Palestinians, and this has been made clear over and over again with each election cycle and during each attack on Gaza. It's a fact, as Rania reminded me in a talk she gave last week in Berkeley, Benjamin Netanyahu admitted that the wall that Israel has built in the West Bank is to prevent, quote, a demographic spillover of Palestinians from the occupied territories. These are not opinions. These are facts, and they deserve to have a platform on college campuses free of censorship. Because of these irrefutable facts, people are joining the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement across the world. This is an international, nonviolent, proactive campaign led by Palestinian civil society to hold Israel accountable because our world leaders won't. It's clear that Israel advocacy groups can't hold on to much support any longer as the veneer is pulled off of Israel every day. As independent media, as television images, and as student campaigns on college campuses expose Israeli policies for what they are policies of apartheid, of segregation, of supremacy, of settler colonialism, of exceptionalism, of unabashed racism that survives because of the U.S.'s interest in keeping those policies in place. Even if top U.S. officials, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, say that the occupation has to end, this remains empty rhetoric, as the U.S. government will not even entertain the idea of stopping its billions of dollars in aid to fund Israel's policies. On August 1st, 2 weeks into the 51-day slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza last summer, President Obama said that it was, quote, heartbreaking to see it all unfold. Corey Robin, who's a spectacular professor at Brooklyn College in New York, said on Twitter, quote, as if he's just a bystander, watching it all unfold. Obama talks about Gaza as if it were a natural disaster, an uncontrollable biological event. Writing in The Intercept about the U.S. and Israel's shared values and the massive donations by the U.S. of cash, weapons, and surveillance to Israel, Glenn Greenwald says on August 3rd, each time Israel attacks Gaza and massacres its trapped civilian population, and at the end of 2008, in the fall of 2012, and now again this past month, the same process repeats itself in both U.S. media and government circles. The U.S. government feeds Israel the weapons it uses and steadfastly defends its aggression both publicly and at the UN. The U.S. Congress unanimously enacts one resolution after the next to support and enable Israel. And then American media figures pretend that the Israeli attack has nothing to do with their country, that it's just some sort of unfortunately intractable, distant conflict between two equally intransigent foreign parties, in response to which all decent Americans helplessly throw up their hands as though they bear no responsibility. Greenwald adds, every Israeli action in Gaza has the U.S.'s fingerprints all over it. This is why BDS exists, because as we all know, true change never comes from the top down. It always, always comes from the grassroots who demand that these types of human rights violations end. As we know from reading our history books, much of that grassroots activism, much of that monumental change begins on campuses with students who are organizing between classes and exams. I'm going to read a little from my book, and I'll begin with the introduction, just to kind of place this movement. One April morning in 2010, just past 5 o'clock, more than 100 college students and activists gathered in an enormous circle on the University of California, Berkeley's Sproul Plaza. For nearly 10 hours, many had given passionate testimonials on the floor of the Student Senate, defending a recently passed resolution that called on the University of California to pull its investments in U.S. companies profiting from Israel's occupation of Palestine. Despite their eloquence and the justness of their cause, the resolution had been vetoed, and the veto had been upheld. And so they gathered in the crisp new dawn on Sproul to comfort each other. Expecting the students to express bitterness, anger, and defeat, instead I witnessed something extraordinary. One by one, students stepped into the center of the circle and spoke emotionally about their commitment to keep pushing forward, to keep fighting for justice in Palestine. The students were not interested in giving up. More than that, they did not feel defeated, but rather they spoke of victory. Through this highly publicized debate, more students and community members had become aware of Israel's policies against Palestinians and the profiting by U.S. corporations off violations of Palestinian rights. Thousands of supporters across the world, including Nobel laureates, rabbis, scholars, and iconic human rights activists, had sent statements supporting the divestment resolution and the students themselves in the weeks leading up to the vote. Now, each student activist proclaimed that they were changing the discourse on Palestine. With each educational event, with each direct action, with each divestment hearing, I aimed my digital recorder toward the middle of the circle, trying to preserve the moment. When I drove home afterwards through the ubiquitous Bay Area fog, still buzzing from the energy in that circle, I knew that what I had witnessed was significant, a powerful turning point in Palestine solidarity activism. Those UC Berkeley students impressed, moved, and inspired me to assiduously document the movement and ultimately to write the book you hold in your hands now. 3 years after that vote, and despite pressure and intimidation by pro-Israel lobby groups and university administrations, students reintroduced a divestment resolution at UC Berkeley. This time, it passed. By May 2014, UC Berkeley was one of 5 undergraduate campuses within the University of California system to pass and uphold divestment resolutions in the student government, and now it's 7 out of 9. While dozens more universities around the country successfully organized divestment hearings, walkouts, sit-ins, rallies, protests, and creative direct action. Okay, let's see. I'm going to jump around the book a little bit. I want to read a section about the campus as a battleground. That's the subsection of this chapter, and how Israel-aligned organizations are developing ways to suppress criticism of Israeli policies on campus. Anti-Palestinian organizations have targeted solidarity movements on U.S. campuses for decades. But since the early 2000s, such groups have more urgently identified criticism of Israeli policy as something to be suppressed, precisely because campuses are places that encourage individuals to challenge the status quo, and also because the campus-based Palestine solidarity movement is expanding year by year. Thus, national Israel advocacy organizations such as Stand With Us, which works closely with Israel's foreign ministry, have been rapidly popping up on U.S. campuses and directly interfering with student Palestine solidarity activism. Boasting a budget of more than $8.7 million as of 2012, Stand With Us works with on-campus Israel advocacy, student groups, and other national anti-Palestinian groups to discredit activists, students, and faculty members who support Palestinian rights. Stand With Us members troll and harass Palestine solidarity activists and flood campuses with pro-Israel propaganda, especially during student-organized Israeli apartheid weeks or Palestine awareness weeks. Leading up to campus divestment hearings, members smear the boycott movement as anti-Semitic and promote Israel as a peaceful, progressive haven for diverse communities. Alex Kane, a New York-based journalist, reported for the online publication Mondoweiss in early February 2014 about a secret document he obtained that exposed the group's strategy to combat Israeli Apartheid Week events on campuses. In the document, meant to be a confidential memo to Israel advocates on U.S. campuses, Stand With Us offered grants of up to $200 to student groups to promote events such as hummus, not Hamas parties. The group also suggested how Israel advocates should deflect criticism about the state's racist and violent treatment of African migrants, and offered talking points to denigrate the Palestinian-led BDS movement. The large, influential, and well-funded AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, I'm sure you're all familiar with it here in D.C., has a wing devoted to on-campus advocacy of Israel and organizes all expense-paid trips for student leaders to visit Israel. AIPAC promotes these trips as opportunities to, quote, prepare young leaders to help build the pro-Israel community on and beyond the campus, noting that they help place students into meetings with U.S. Congress members to help advocate for Israel's interests. Israel-aligned students can also become Hasbara fellows. Hasbara is a Hebrew word that translates to public diplomacy, which is frequently synonymized with propaganda. Paid advocates for Israel found on 120 university campuses across the country. The Boston-based David Project, however, has gone a step beyond plain propagandizing. In a white paper document released in 2013, the David Project, which is a Zionist, quote, educational organization founded by Americans for Peace and Tolerance's, I know that name, Charles Jacobs, encouraged student advocates for Israel to exploit personal relationships with different student organizations in order to get them to adopt anti-Palestinian positions and to threaten faculty members who challenge the bias towards Israel in their coursework. Writing in the Electronic Intifada about the David Project's white paper, Abraham Greenhouse reported that the document examines the potential of students of color and marginalized communities to align with Palestine solidarity groups and recommends tactics for Israel-aligned activists to steer such persons toward sympathy with Israel instead. The document, Greenhouse adds, quote, also suggests a manipulative strategy for seeking disciplinary action against faculty members critical of Israeli policies. Beyond suggesting the use of administrative mechanisms to suppress academic freedom, anti-Palestinian advocacy groups have encouraged activists, including full-time campus-based professionals, to cultivate relationships of an extremely questionable nature with campus administrators and even with campus police. I'm going to skip around. I'm going to read a section about the ways in which students have been organizing around the BDS call, demanding that their tuition dollars don't go to support occupation in Palestine. So let's see here. Today, 10 years since the official BDS call against Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism was launched, the movement has grown exponentially around the world. Victories are being won as students, trade unions, academics, faith-based groups, cultural workers, and human rights defenders campaign for Palestinian rights, using the BDS movement as a way to educate, energize activism, and, as in South Africa, make Israel's occupation and apartheid system economically and politically unviable. Hoda Mitwali of CUNY Law School in Queens, New York, told me that the BDS movement reinvigorated the Palestine Solidarity movement in the mid-2000s. She said that the generation of activists that came before was torn apart by internal political debates. Instead of creating a strong solidarity struggle in the United States, activists were discussing political solutions for Palestinians in Palestine, such as one state versus two states. These were, she said, things regarding the future of Palestine that I'm not sure if solidarity activists in the West can really have a place to weigh in on. I don't think that they have that place, actually, she said. So with the BDS call, this really remedies it. Because here we're not calling for a political solution. We're restoring agency to Palestinians to do that. What we're doing is recognizing the privileges we have in the U.S. and the responsibilities that come with that by targeting corporations, by targeting government and military aid to Israel, and that's ultimately how we can be most effective. And in that chapter, I talk a little bit more about Berkeley, which I mentioned in the introduction that I read from. During the time between votes, so that the Berkeley Divestment Resolution passed in April 2010, it was vetoed, and then there was a vote to either uphold or discredit the veto, and the veto was upheld. But during that time, in between the two votes, I'll just jump in here, influential Israel-aligned organizations and the regional Israel Council excoriated the divestment resolution at UC Berkeley. Jonathan Kessler, a top official for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, stated plainly and openly at a conference in Washington, D.C., that AIPAC would, quote, he actually said this, make sure that pro-Israel students take over the student government and reverse the pro-divestment vote at UC Berkeley. He added without nuance, quote, this is how AIPAC operates in our nation's capital. This is how AIPAC must operate on our nation's campuses. It was clear that the pro-Israel lobby's pressure was significant and would be unrelenting against the student senators. 1 week after the divestment vote passed, the Student Senate President, Will Smelko, vetoed the resolution. It was a devastating turn of events for students who had worked so hard for this divestment success. Moreover, it showed how closely the pro-Israel lobby and governmental representatives were watching the campus divestment movement and how much they were gearing up to stop such activism in its tracks. Smelko's vote had to be confirmed in a vote by the Student Senate in order to make it legitimate, and pro-Israel lobby groups descended on the UC Berkeley administration with their full might to pressure senators to back the veto. Because of the ways in which Palestine solidarity campaigns are expanding, and because of the panic by on-campus and off-campus Israel lobby groups, we see a push to censor and shut down speech critical of Israel, as though if you just shove it under the rug, people won't care about it and will just give up. These are acts of desperation, but they do have real consequences for activism. We see student activists being forced to pay extra fees for security when they hold events with Palestine activists or scholars, thereby punishing SJPs for the possible actions of others. and restricting students' abilities to hold events with already depleted budgets. We also see students defying threats of punishment by university administrations if they go forward with direct actions on campus. Just last week, I covered a story for the Electronic Intifada about a campus in Southern California at Pitzer College, in which students were denied permission to build a mock apartheid wall on campus due to pressure from pro-Israel groups who insisted that such a display would promote anti-Semitism, again using this absurd rhetoric in order to censor speech on campus. The SJP group at Pitzer knew that their rights had been violated and decided to construct the mock wall anyway. Liz Jackson, staff attorney with Palestine Solidarity Legal Support, said, quote, "As it should, Pitzer claims to embrace a compelling interest in unfettered inquiry and the collective search for knowledge. Under California law, there can be no Palestine exception to this policy." A student I spoke with there said that Pitzer SJP is prepared to go through administrative proceedings as necessary to defend their rights to free speech and to organize on behalf of Palestinians' rights. We have to support and stand with these students who are facing threats and being singled out by university administrations. Faculty, too, are being pressured by outside political groups to remain silent on Israeli policy in Palestine. Of course, we saw what happened to Professor Steven Saleta and the University of Illinois, who essentially fired him for tweeting about his outrage at the massacres in Gaza over the summer, particularly the killings of children. He filed a comprehensive lawsuit against the university for violating his rights of free speech and violating the contract of his employment. At UCLA, we saw the attempted witch hunt of Professor David Shorter by an outside right-wing Israel advocacy organization, an attempt which actually failed miserably. They tried to get him fired because of a few books or articles he recommended on a non-required reading list for his students, including a review that the Electronic Intifada published of a book critiquing Zionism. For professors who don't have tenure yet or who are new to teaching, it can be a harrowing time to speak out against Israel's crimes because of the relentless intimidation and threats meted out by these outside groups, insinuating that if they sign a petition in support of a divestment resolution or put a book on their syllabus that criticizes the Zionist project or even hold discussions in their classroom, they could have their entire academic career wiped out. Student representatives of the Israel advocacy group Stand With Us and their employees posing as students sit in on classes and have told professors that they're being watched. This is reflective of Israel-aligned groups panicking that they are losing their arguments over and over again. But the amount of fear-based panic that anti-Palestinian groups are employing cannot suppress the fact that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is growing. They cannot suppress scholarly critique of Israeli policies in the classroom, and they cannot bear that Palestine solidarity activism is becoming more and more mainstream. They also cannot bear that Palestinian solidarity movements are linking up with other movements of liberation and struggle around the country and around the world. In my book, I dive into the growing intersectional alliances between different communities and the Palestine solidarity movement. I traveled to the U.S.-Mexico border states where students are marching hand in hand with Latino, Chicano, and indigenous communities, fighting for immigrant justice and against state-sponsored detentions and deportations. As we saw recently in the uprisings around Ferguson and the national Black Lives Matter protests, Palestinian communities and Black communities are forging strong bonds of solidarity with each other. Students involved in LGBTQ liberation struggles and women's reproductive rights, workers' rights, and the rights of the disabled are also linking up with Palestine solidarity coalitions. I'll read a little bit from the chapter on the extraordinary intersections of struggle. One of the clearest ways the United States and Israel exemplify their shared values begins with the walls both countries have constructed to keep others out. At the U.S.-Mexico border, which stretches from California to Texas, the U.S. government's expanding practices of border militarization have reached unprecedented levels, and Israel has stepped in to not just share the technology it has field-tested on Palestinians, but to profit from this project as well. In March 2013, one of the two leading contractors for Israel's wall in the West Bank, an Israeli company named Elbit Systems, won its second contract worth $145 million to provide surveillance systems for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Elbit's first contract with the U.S. government provided 450 unmanned drones to the Arizona Border Patrol in 2004. Writing the Electronic Intifada, Jimmy Johnson reported, quote, "The new DHS contract calls for, quote, integrated fixed tower systems that will assist Border Patrol agents in detecting, tracking, identifying, and classifying items of interest along the border. This contract largely reprises Elbit's role in the Boeing contract. Initial installations will be in Arizona. Both the U.S. and Israeli projects affirm settler state partitions of indigenous land, Palestinian land in the Israeli case, and Tohono O'odham land in Arizona. The Tohono O'odham Nation is just one of several indigenous nations facing further partition because of U.S. and Mexican border policies, and both projects intend to stop the movement of persons under the guise of security. In 2011, SJP organizers in Arizona started organizing tours to the border wall with other students from Palestinian, Jewish, white European, and Chicano backgrounds, just observing, quote, seeing it firsthand. Gabriel Chavone, who I talked to for this chapter, said that, quote, and then talking about it, taking it in, discussing it, putting on conferences with students and speakers from all over the country, from Palestine-oriented activism, and from Chicano and human rights and border work. We put it all together and learned about each other's struggles. I also document how Israel lobby organizations are reacting to these strengthening ties between communities of color and trying to court them to back Israel. Groups like the Anti-Defamation League are, quote, particularly worried about the growing alliances between Palestine solidarity groups and the Latino community, writes Ali Abunimah in his book, The Battle for Justice in Palestine. Quote, for the ADL, Latino and LGBTQ individuals and groups are no more than passive recipients of Palestinian propaganda. The implication is that if any see a common interest, share similar experiences with Palestinians, or resist the use of their communities in Israeli propaganda, they have somehow been duped, Abunimah notes. Similarly, he adds that as Israel ramps up its racist treatment of African asylum seekers, arresting and detaining thousands of people, sending them into squalid detention camps in the desert, and planning schemes of mass deportation back to countries where they face violent persecution and imminent death, Israel's propagandizing efforts to deflect criticism of such racist policies has been aimed at black communities in the United States. As independent journalist David Sheen and author Max Blumenthal have so importantly documented during the past few years, Israeli politicians have incited violence and racist pogroms against non-Jewish Africans in Israel. Government ministers such as Miri Regev have been the face of Israel's systematized racism toward non-Jewish Africans. Appointed to lead the sector that determines the state's policies affecting asylum seekers, Regev famously called African refugees a cancer, and then later apologized, not to Africans, but to cancer victims for comparing them to Africans. Another Israeli leader, Interior Minister Eli Yishai, did not feel the need to mince words when he claimed in 2012 that, quote, most of those people arriving here are Muslims who think the country doesn't belong to us, the white man. What do you even say? It's all right there, right? As I make the point in my book, this is not a radical fringe movement anymore. It is not an isolated band of activists on isolated islands of U.S. campuses. This movement has teeth. This movement is supported by countless human rights and civil rights-based activism groups. This movement is supported by dozens and dozens of campus-based student organizations fighting for liberation, whether it be black liberation, queer liberation, women's liberation, by workers who fight for economic justice, by those on the front lines of the prison abolition movements, by those fighting for the rights of the disabled, by those fighting to be seen and heard in this country and across the world. What is clear is that consensus in support of Palestinian rights is here. This is an exciting time to be a student organizer on campus. This is a very important time. Despite the relentless attacks, despite the organized opposition designed to crush this movement, students and faculty are not deterred. In my book, In Our Power, U.S. Students Organize for Justice in Palestine, I was lucky to be able to document this movement at a very special and important time in history. I interviewed nearly 70 students from all over the country who are working day and night to campaign for Palestinian rights, at the same time campaigning for the rights of the people rendered invisible in their local communities. The connections are clear, students told me, between organizing for justice in Palestine and organizing for justice at the U.S.-Mexico border and organizing for the rights of people locked into prisons, people under the thumb of layers of oppression in this country. At the very end of the book, there's a chapter about how students define solidarity, and the statements I got from students are incredibly moving and nuanced. I want to end this talk by quoting two students from this chapter. The first is Amanda Ghanem, a Palestinian-American SJP organizer and student at the University of Michigan in Dearborn. She told me, quote, "Solidarity is not saying this is how Palestinians should resist, this is what they should do. It's about elevating, respecting, and supporting the voices of Palestinians who resist every day. It's also taking responsibility for your own participation in it. As an American citizen, I do feel like I participate in it. I feel like the two halves of my identity are the occupied and the occupier. I have this passport in a land that I grew up in that without its support, there might not be this occupation. And on the other hand, in my blood is Palestine." Finally, at the very end of this chapter, and with the last quote of the book, is Omar Shocker. He was a law student at Stanford, and Stanford actually just passed a divestment resolution, so go Stanford. Omar says that more than 75%, he used to joke, that more than 75% of their time was centered on student organizing, even though they're paying an extraordinary amount of tuition to be there. He said, "That's all to say that anyone who's involved in this movement has skin in the game. It would have been easier not to be an activist," he admitted. "It would have been easier to do almost anything else. It's not just in terms of your academic career, but also families, even coming from a family that is Muslim or Arab in my case, or for other members who are Palestinian. Many families encourage their children to just focus on their own careers and not get involved in activism. So I think we all feel a sense of being in this together." In 2010, Shocker traveled to the West Bank with a richly diverse group of about 8 student organizers from colleges on the East Coast and the West Coast. At one point, he said, "We went to the separation wall with a can of spray paint, and we spray painted Reunion in Liberated Jerusalem in 2030. We all made a pact together that we were going to work to end the occupation and to have a Jerusalem in a liberated land where everyone was treated equally. We're all committed to that. We put that on the wall and took a picture, and all of us check in every year to see how we're all working to get toward that goal." He said that the pact speaks to the level of investment that the group felt working for justice in Palestine. Quote, "And we know that when the separation wall comes down, which is only a matter of time, the collective effort of students will have played a part in making that happen." Thank you.
This year, this past fall, my alma mater, which I would rather not name out of loyalty, which is in New England, got a new chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine. If you know the story, you will recognize the college. The students hung posters around campus with the question, "What does Zionism mean to you?" with pens hanging down. This was deemed anti-Semitic. I'm a little bit shaky because I'm emotional. Forgive me. This was deemed anti-Semitic, and there was a big fuss about it in the Boston Globe. Subsequently, I donated $200 to that chapter of SJP. The donation was processed on February 6th. And the SJP chapter has not received the money. Mm-hmm. Here's my question. You want a question? Here's the question. Is there some way that I can find out who the big donors to my college are so that I will know what kind of pressure they might be under?
It's a really good question. It depends with each university. I think it's more easily, information about donors are more easily accessible in public universities. Private universities make it pretty hard to divulge information about not just their donors, but also companies that they're invested in. So, for example, when students are planning their divestment campaigns at private universities, it's really there's a level of non-transparency in the whole process, where universities don't have to explain where they invest tuition money. So there's, I'm sure you could talk to students and try to figure it out a little bit, but that's also one of the points that students are trying to make in these campaigns, that their tuition dollars are going to support an unknown countless number of companies that do business with Israel and profit from Israel's violations of Palestinians' rights. And therefore, more and more we're seeing students demanding transparency from their university administrations, along with demanding that they stop investing in these companies. So, yeah, there's a lot of conversation around that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Since you have been active among students about this Palestinian solidarity, could you tell us which is stronger, actually, the Palestinian movement or students for the Israel? Because outside, from the public eye, it's like the for pro-Israel is very strong. And also regarding the donor, I am curious whether there is a strong donor for the Palestinian solidarity movement, like, for example, in the Jewish community, the millionaire Sheldon.
Oh.
So is there comparable like that for the?
So I'll take that question first. Actually, the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network just came out with an incredibly comprehensive report on the I think it's like 13 major donors to the Islamophobia industry, including the donors like Sheldon Adelson and the Koch brothers, who work very hard to suppress criticism of Israeli policies on college campuses and in communities all over the country. So I encourage you all to read that report. I can't remember what it's called, but it's the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, or IJAN.org, and you can read that report there. In terms of strength, it's all in how you define strength. In terms of like moral strength, strength and determination to, because of the outrage that students feel about the violations in Palestine, I think that SJP has an unfettered amount of strength to it, and they are working against a very strong opposition. But that opposition is only strong because there's a lot of money behind it, and because at this point their narrative has become so much of the normalized status quo in discourse that people, thinking that they're taking a neutral position, are taking the position of Israel and the occupier and the occupation. But we do see that eroding quite rapidly. Palestine activism, as I said, is becoming more and more mainstream, especially on college campuses. Discussions of Palestine is becoming more normalized in classrooms and in the local communities. And I think if we look at our history books, strength of the grassroots movement against injustice is so much more powerful than the strength of the opposition. Anybody else?
I thought the question the lady was asking was, who are the financial backers of the SJP?
Oh, of SJP. Well,
and I have a second question. Who is actually divested?
Okay. Financial backers of SJP are people who buy falafel during their falafel fundraiser. Students are selling. There's bake sales to hold events on campuses. They don't have a real financial structure at all. They rely on whatever tiny amounts that university administrations let them have in terms of student group budgets, and for that, SJPs are routinely singled out for discrimination and have to go through these extraordinary obstacles just to get that sort of event funding and resources in place that other student groups aren't subjected to. That said, there are extraordinary organizations that are working to support SJP legally and in advocacy circles. So we're talking about the Palestine Solidarity Legal Support, Center for Constitutional Rights, National Lawyers Guild, ACLU, and also community organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, and American Muslims for Palestine. There are these national advocacy organizations. But in terms of, there's no comparison between how SJP organizations have no budget, and Israel-aligned organizations have, like I was just hearing last night, that there are 20 staff members at Columbia University alone in the Hillel chapter. Staff members, they're paid. Whereas, Palestine Solidarity Legal Support, which covers advocacy for students all over the country, have 5 staff members in total. And there's no paid staff members of SJP anywhere in the country. So we're really looking at a very disparate situation in terms of funding. But again, in terms of moral equivalence, there's no comparison. Yeah. And what was the other question? I'm sorry.
Who was actually divested?
Oh, who is divested? So most divestment resolutions are purely symbolic at this point. This was the case also during the anti-apartheid South Africa divestment campaigns in the 1980s, in which students were passing these divestment resolutions in their student body governments or in their student senates, and really building this consensus so that finally the tipping point came and university administrations were forced to apply the demands of the democratic student voice. The same is happening here. Dozens and dozens of student groups around the country have divested, have held and passed divestment resolutions on their campuses. These divestment resolutions, as I said, are symbolic. They demand that the university pull their investments in companies that are profiting from Israel's occupation. Only one university in the country has actually implemented divestment so far, and that's Hampshire College in western Massachusetts. And they were also the first university in the country to implement divestment against apartheid South Africa. So 1979, 30 years later, in 2009, Hampshire became the first to divest from Israel.
The Presbyterian Church.
Presbyterian Church, of course, the Presbyterian Church and the Methodist Church, and yeah, they have they're more or less mainstreaming divestment in the kind of faith-based discourse, which is really important and needs to be a lot more needs to be done in that realm, of course, as well.
Thank you. Could you give us an idea of the scope of the SJPs? Like, how many are there? How many students?
Yeah.
So, what kind of coverage are we talking, especially in relationship to the other side? And the other thing is, can you talk a little bit more about how they're coming together to support each other, as opposed to lone SJPs on this campus, that campus,
Right.
how they're uniting, and ways that they might be encouraged to think more strategically and into the future?
Yeah. So it's hard to count. I keep asking for updates on the actual number, and even the national coordinators can't keep up. But at this point, it's safe to say that there are approximately 150 different SJP chapters around the country. SJP started in the early 2000s at UC Berkeley. And after about 2005, 2006, it really expanded. And they were still kind of disparate, sort of, not really working a lot together. But that kind of changed in 2009, 2010, when the National Students for Justice in Palestine Coalition was formed. And since then, there have been annual conferences with hundreds of student activists from all over the country, from pretty much every SJP chapter, who have come together for these 2 or 3 day long conferences and really have done extraordinary knowledge sharing, mentorship, incredibly moving panels on, again, intersectionality between movements, the importance of placing SJP chapters in the local communities and working alongside local struggles. And I think it's really given, especially newly formed SJP chapters, a lot of support and synergy, an ability to kind of, not come to this, from out of nowhere, from a vacuum, but to really take the lessons and the advice from SJP chapters that have been around a little bit longer, in order to build their momentum and their campaigns on campuses. So it's really beautiful. And every year the SJP national conferences get larger and larger, with more and more chapters showing up and more students becoming involved from all different backgrounds, all different student groups. It's extraordinary. So I just see this movement growing and growing exponentially every year. Yeah.
like you were saying, that the donor for the Palestinian solidarity, it's more like small grassroots here and
Yeah.
there. So it makes me wonder why there are no big donors for the Palestinians, let's say, like Sheldon, for example, for the. So
What
is
we
it
could do with billions of dollars.
yeah, is it lacking of PR on the Palestinian side, or the big donors, they just do not sympathize with Palestinian movement, or can you?
That's a
tell us
really
the
good
reason?
question. It's really hard to answer. I think, more and more it is, maybe this is just my own opinion, but like social justice movements have never been funded by huge donors. It's just kind of, we all kind of pull together what we have, the scraps, in our pockets and bank accounts to keep, these movements alive. I think that's just kind of a historical context for these kinds of movements. But I think donors, not foundations, are probably wary of giving grants and funding to SJPs because of the ways in which the Israel-aligned organizations are really having this McCarthyist party right now. Like they're going around witch hunting anyone who's even connected to SJP. I mean, Rania can tell you all about the kinds of threats that she receives on a daily basis from people who don't want her to be reporting about what she reports on, and we all get that. It's kind of a normal thing that happens when you're either a journalist or an activist or a student organizer campaigning for Palestinian rights. You are put in the center of targets by these people who want you to shut up and not speak out. So that could be some of the reason why these foundations are hesitant to help SJPs fund their organizing.
So in other words, the Israel part is more robust in the PR.
Yeah, well, they have money for PR. I mean, they spend a lot of money on PR campaigns. They spend a lot of money employing students to be their PR people on campuses. Yeah, they have a lot of money, but what else is new? Like, this is how, the oppressive governments and regimes always are good at their PR until it all falls apart. And I think that as Palestine activism becomes more and more mainstream, as people can see through the rhetoric more clearly, I think now more than ever, I think that no amount of PR is going to cover what Israel is doing, and I think students are at the forefront of making that happen. Yeah.
Can I
Yeah.
ask we're kind of running out of time. I just wanted to ask a question, something you alluded to a few times in your talk, about the personal challenges of these very courageous student leaders, whether problems in terms of how their families support them or don't, if there have been any hate crimes against them, or if any of them have gone on to try to travel to Palestine and Israel, have been turned away. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually, the woman who I quoted next to last in my book, Amanda from Dearborn, Michigan, she says in my book, she's actually the first person that I talk to as well, and the first person I quote, and she talks about wanting to go and visit Palestine. Her parents are Palestinians, second generation. They've never been to Palestine. Her grandparents were born there and were expelled in 1948. And about a year ago, Amanda, after the book was all sent to the printer, Amanda did try to get into Palestine, and she was turned away. She was denied entry. And it's unclear. It's very arbitrary. Israeli border soldiers never really give much reasons, although there is, of course, a disproportionate amount of Palestinians or people of Arab descent or with Muslim-sounding names even that are denied entry for no reason at all other than they are not the right kind of human that Israel wants to allow in. And this happens a lot. It's activists really put themselves at risk, not just, in order to be able to get into Palestine, to visit their homeland, but also, it could damage their career. They can't, sometimes students feel like they can't put SJP activism on their resumes when applying for jobs or graduate school. precisely because it has this connotation because of the way that Israel-aligned organizations have denigrated this movement, that it could be detrimental to their career to be part of it. And there are students who I spoke to who didn't want to be named in the book precisely for these reasons, and that's I completely respect that. It is a very it's a personal choice that students make every day when they are a part of Palestine solidarity activism. And not just that, but yeah, like as you mentioned, it's routine that Palestine solidarity activists, primarily Muslim women, to be physically harassed and threatened on campuses. There have been a spate of attacks in the last few years that Palestine Solidarity Legal Support has documented, in which Muslim students have had their hijabs pulled off and people have spat in their face, called terrorists, all these horrifying incidents that unfortunately some students feel is like, oh, that's just another Tuesday. This happens all the time. And it's awful that that's being normalized and that university administrations are not doing everything they can to make sure that campuses are free from that kind of hatred. So it's definitely something that's happening. But with organizations like Palestine Solidarity Legal Support, there are now ways that students can feel more secure and feel support.